I was planning on making this video about control play patterns. In fact, I even started drafting up a script for it. I made a comment in my last video where I mentioned talking about its play patterns, and a lot of people, both in the comments and on the Discord server, link in the description, join if you haven't yet, they seemed really excited about a video like that, so it seemed like a natural thing to do next. The problem with this is that I was constantly referencing threats and who the problem at the table is, which is context a lot of people don't have good ground to stand on, as parsing threats at commander tables is a skill in and of itself, and every time I tried to explain threat assessment succinctly, it felt like something that would easily double the length of the video. On top of this, I haven't seen anything on YouTube that I feel does the topic proper justice, so it's not like I can link to something else as a primer for it and feel like I'm giving the topic the space it deserves. Thus, instead of doubling the length of this video, I decided to start with this first, a guide to threat assessment, as detailed and complete as I can possibly make it, hopefully the last one you'll ever need. I want this to be something I or anyone else can show a newer player and give them a good understanding of threat assessment. I also want this to be something that even an enfranchised player can watch and get some new perspectives out of, so hopefully this has something for everyone. All that said, I'll try to avoid wasting your time and hop right into it.
You stupid piece of shit. I'll fucking kill you.
Okay, so first of all, what exactly is a threat? This might seem like a question with a very obvious answer, but let me cook here. If we want to abstract this to a really silly degree, we can call any card in the game a threat, as they will all eventually kill you in some way, or contribute to it. A 1/1 could be a threat, as it will eventually kill you. I don't think this is a particularly useful way to view the game, though, and approaching play like this is just a way to overload yourself with information and make it impossible to actually understand the board state. So let's think about this in terms of 1v1 20 life formats. Your opponent playing a 1/1 when you have no cards in hand and nothing on board puts you on a 20-turn clock, meaning you have 20 turns to live unless you can do something about it. This is likely going to be a very easy situation to crawl out of, but in this world, that 1/1 is a threat that has you on a 20-turn clock. The second you play anything larger than it, though, it stops being a threat and your opponent gets put on a shorter clock. Even a 2/2 completely invalidates their threat and gives you one. The same applies to Commander, and the clocks become drastically longer in a 4-player, 40-life format. We have to acknowledge that the opponent with the 5/5 isn't trying to kill you specifically, but rather win the game by taking every opponent out. Thus, his 5/5 needs to swing 24 times to actually win the game. The table is on a 24-turn clock. This is obviously not a clock worth paying attention to. The likelihood that you aren't going to have a way to win the game in 24 turns is incredibly low. The assumed clock that you have on the rest of the table, meaning how long it will take you to win, is lower than the assumed clock that the 5/5 alone has on you. Thus, it isn't particularly threatening. Fundamentally, despite my qualms with value pile mid-range, this format's a race. Granted, it's a race in the same way Mario Kart is a race, as you use tools to both accelerate your own game plan and stop other people's. The clock any given player has is the amount of time they have until they cross the finish line. This all hits the core of how I consider threats in this game. I'm constantly looking at the cards I have and the position I have on board and trying to figure out how long it's going to take me to win the game in the best case scenario where nobody stops me. I'm also constantly looking at the board states of other players and making inferences about the cards they have in their hands and try to figure out how long it would take them to win. Or, in other words, figure out what everyone's clock is, how many turns until each player can feasibly present a win. A threat is any card that makes an opponent's clock lower than my own. Anything that does this is something that I have to deal with before that clock reaches 0 and I lose. And this is what I would define as a threat in Commander. Another piece of jargon I'm going to be using a lot is the problem. This is a lot easier to define since we've already talked about the clock thing. The problem is the person at the table who has the lowest clock on the rest of the table, the guy who is or is about to just run away with the game. The thing about all this that I feel most people drop the ball on is that this is a 4-player format, and typically you are not the archenemy. So when you look at a 10-10, you should see it as maybe 10 damage every third turn, not 10 damage every single turn. The same applies to basically any other dangerous card. It's probably going to affect your opponents just as much as it affects you, maybe even much more. So as long as you can capitalize on life totals going down, it might be more of a boon than a threat to you specifically. This very nicely segues into the next chapter, which is...
It's weird because...
What you say, that you only meant well, 'cause you did, what you say.
Why any of this shit matters. And again, this might seem like a dumb question with an obvious answer, but let me cook. We're simmering. The obvious answer as to why this matters is that missing who the problem is will lead you to lose to them. This is true, but a much less appreciated reason for it mattering is that every time you make an enemy that isn't the problem, you are making that player's position worse and your own position worse by merit of you having to deal with their retaliation. You might be sitting there wondering why you wouldn't want to make an opponent's position worse. After all, you're probably trying to win the game. The thing is that every opponent is also an ally against whoever the problem currently is. Plus, if they look scarier than you do, they're also another person that removal, attacks, and other tomfoolery can get directed at, as opposed to you. If you're making enemies that you don't absolutely have to be making, you're wasting your resources dealing with things you would much rather other people waste their own resources on, as well as taking attention away from who the actual problem at the table is. The actual strategy of Commander is a lot closer to that of poker than traditional 60-card Magic the Gathering. If you're trying to win the game, your goal is to use game knowledge and social cues to figure out what everyone has, or, in Commander, what the clock they have on the table is. On top of this, you're trying to do your best to obfuscate what you have, or at the very least, make other people think it's worse than what they have. Continuing poker analogies a bit, you might recognize that someone at the table is more skilled or has a better deck than you. Or maybe that their way of playing the game with the deck that they have counters the way that you play the game with the deck that you have. In situations like this, you might want to sit back and let other players find ways to deal with that player while you subtly support them, or find ways to deal with that opponent through your draws. Ultimately, this all can make your opponent's tools in your game plan. You're trying to use them as additional life totals, additional removal, additional cards in hand, and additional board state by allying with them against the players that you suspect will be problematic. This all works even better at instant speed, as you can wait to lock into your threat assessment decisions until the very last moment, but I'm getting ahead of myself with that. Ultimately, you can't do any of this if you aren't properly assessing threats, and properly assessing who the problem at the table is. If you aren't approaching your games with a mindset where you're careful about the enemies that you make, you're bound to give the wrong players wiggle room that lets them run away with the game while you fight pointless battles with players that could have helped you stop them. Similarly, you could accidentally ally yourself with the wrong player and not recognize that they're rapidly becoming unmanageable, basically just king-making someone because you were scared of the wrong guy. Regardless, at the end of the day, if you aren't properly assessing threats at the table, you're going to have shitty games that end in unsatisfying ways. So, we've talked about how we can define a threat and why it matters that we can identify them. The oven is on, the seasonings are out, and the roast is on the counter. How exactly do we assess who the problem is, and what cards represent these threats in what situations?
Don't let me into my zone. Don't let me into my zone. I'm definitely in my zone.
Value is shorthand for card, mana, and board advantage. It's building momentum that can win the game. Players tend to generate value by playing permanents on the board and using them to snowball into more value until they have enough presence to win a game. A common problem with threat assessment among casual players is they only focus on what is immediately on the board, and ignore other game zones where players can build value. As far as this goes, we have 4 things to focus on, those being the battlefield, players' hands, players' graveyards, and players' libraries. Obvious threats live on the battlefield. These are things like big creatures, lots of creatures, permanents that can directly deal damage to a player, artifacts and enchantments that buff their board or debuff yours, or some sort of card that generates value on board, like a doubling season or something. Realistically, you have a good idea of how to assess this kind of board state in a vacuum. It's just adding up the amount of damage everyone is representing directly on their board. This is sort of the first level of threat assessment. It's incredibly easy to intuit, and I'd be surprised if anyone playing the game didn't have a grasp on it. The less obvious things are things that generate value in or from other zones, like permanents that draw cards, self-mill, copy spells, things that turn a resource that isn't on board into damage, discard outlets, or cards that let opponents cast off the top of their decks. These are all a lot more related to the other zones. For instance, a discard outlet is a signal to you that you might want to pay attention to a player's graveyard. It's a sign that the player might actually want to discard their threats and reanimate them on a later turn. It gives them a way to convert value in hand into value in the graveyard. And if they want value in their graveyard, you can pretty easily assume they have ways to convert it into value on board. The same exact thing applies to cards like Future Sight, the Reality Chip, or Impulse Draw enablers. They convert the deck into a resource to be used, and if your opponent is running them, they likely have the tools to capitalize on that conversion. This is central to threat assessment, and understanding how players can convert value into different zones into value on board that will kill you. Threats on the board don't just materialize out of nowhere. They start as threats in the hand, in the graveyard, or threats in your deck. Signals like discard outlets, threats in the graveyard, permanents that let your opponent impulse draw or cast spells from the top of their deck, or permanents that give additional benefits from casting spells, all say something about what could be coming in your game, and a critical mass of any of these signals represents just as much danger as a critical mass of threats on the board. This is to say that if an opponent has a graveyard full of terrifying threats, or a Ruth in play with a bunch of mana and ways to impulse draw, or 30 cards in hand, they probably have the capacity to present a massive threat by converting the resources they have in other zones into resources on the battlefield. You can't just make your assessments based upon what is currently on the board. You also need to be aware of what is likely going to be on the board in the next few turns. Luckily for you, the graveyard and the battlefield are both public information. You can see ways your opponents are building into converting other resources into resources on the battlefield by looking at what permanents they have out and in their graveyard. In blind pods, this is especially important, as you don't actually know what is in your opponent's deck, and the information you get from seeing what's on board and in their graveyard lets you make inferences about what the rest of their deck contains, and how much you should be afraid of what they have going on. You'll notice that the hand and the deck aren't public information. This isn't much of a problem for the deck, as the only time that threats from the deck aren't random is when a player is tutoring for them, and everyone already knows to be afraid of that. The big issue is the hand. You have no idea what cards are in your opponent's hand, and chances are they're cultivating them to give them the highest chance of winning. It's a completely blind zone for you as a player, and learning how to assess it properly is probably the biggest jump you can make in threat assessment. The token player sitting with 20 1/1 squirrels probably doesn't seem that scary when you have a board that could eat half of them, but if Craterhoof is in his hand, you're kinda just fucked unless you have an answer. The hand being a secret zone means it can convert threats you weren't even aware of into threats on board, which makes it by far the scariest zone in the game. You simply don't know for sure what could come out of it. This cleanly brings us to our penultimate chapter.
さあ、足元に気をつけて。この週末は楽しく過ごそうじゃないか。二人きりで。
Typically, the player who wins any game of Magic the Gathering is the one who spends the most mana. There are two things required to spend mana. That is, mana to spend, and things to spend it on. If the guy who spends the most mana wins thing isn't self-evident, think about it for a moment. If you had infinite mana and your entire deck in your hand, you would win. If you had no mana and no cards in hand, you wouldn't be able to do anything. Increasing the number of cards in hand and mana to spend them increases the amount of shenanigans you can pull exponentially. The more of both you have, the better off you are in the game. Thus, spending more mana makes you win. Again, lucky for you, both available mana and ways to spend it are public information. It's incredibly easy to see how much mana a player has available, and if your eyes are bad or the player is some sort of sociopath that just stacks their lands in a big pile, you always can just ask them. It's also incredibly easy to just ask a player how many cards they have in hand. And if it isn't obvious, you should be doing both of these things, quite a bit. A player with a scary board but no cards in hand and no way of converting their graveyard or library into threats is just as much of a threat as they look like. They have no way of making their board any more scary than it currently is. Your ability to assess them as a threat is completely reliant on your ability to check if they have the resources to kill you. It's effectively solved. However, a player with a less scary board, 15 cards in hand and 10 untapped mana sources, almost certainly has the capacity to become incredibly scary incredibly quickly. And if you're only focused on their immediate board presence, they're likely going to do it without you having any idea it's coming. What this all means is that any player with a lot of cards in hand and a lot of mana to use them on is a threat. It doesn't matter in the slightest what they have on board. If they have both of those things, they have all the tools they need to start causing massive problems in your game, and you need to treat them accordingly. Note this doesn't just stop at cards in hand. It also applies to how many cards they've drawn total. If there's an opponent discarding to 7 every turn cycle, pay attention to how long it takes them to decide their discards. People don't take a full minute and a half picking a card to discard when their hand isn't filled with gas. The players who draw the most cards and make the most mana are always going to be the problem at some point very soon. Treat them accordingly. I've said this like 3 times by now, but I didn't title this chapter The Most Valuable Heuristic for nothing. This is really important information, and if you haven't internalized it already, you should as soon as possible. Obviously, there's some more nuance to this than I'm presenting, but leaning heavily into this will do you better than ignoring it. You'll figure the nuance out with time if you're treating cards in hand as a signal for how threatening someone is. To continue on with this a bit, we know that 5/5s and even 10/10s aren't that threatening all in all. They put the table on a 24 and 12 turn clock respectively. More than enough time to do something about it. But when someone has tons of cards and mana, more often than not, you probably have less than 2 turns to do something about them before they run away with the game. Less than 2 turns to do something is not a good thing. Time is not on your side in that circumstance. So you need to be able to see this coming and do something about it before the threat becomes terminal. In other words, you need to consider ramp and card draw as high-level threats. The people that invest a lot of resources into doing this need to either be shut down with interaction or have their life total pressured down before they can develop the kind of board state that these resources can generate. This is, for most casual players, the most important piece of information in this video. If you aren't scared of people drawing cards, you should be, and you should be doing more to either keep them from doing so or keep them in check while they do. This, not so cleanly, brings us to our final chapter.
Face it, you're never gonna make it.
I don't want to make it. I just want to.
Commander is a format with a lot of variants. More than you realize. More than I realize. More than probably anyone realizes. The number of viable decks in this format dwarfs that of any other, and due to its casual nature, people are actually playing extremely different lists from each other. I recently went to MagicCon Chicago and played Commander in the play area for close to 34 hours with a bunch of people I'd never met before. And if it taught me anything, it's that nobody playing this game can fully assess a threat they aren't used to playing against. Players let me resolve spells I couldn't dream of resolving at my LGS, and people would blow up my board or kill me after a storm turn because I didn't recognize certain cards as enablers for a certain strategy. It was the Wild West. Nobody really knew what was going on in anyone else's decks, and games would swing hard and fast when the pods were for randoms. This wasn't the case, however, when people who were friends with each other would play with a couple of randoms. Generally speaking, the friends would do a stellar job of keeping each other in check, while the randoms either ran away with the game or lagged behind due to a power imbalance. The thing that I'm getting at here is that you straight up can't learn what specific cards are threatening and why they're threatening unless you've played against them. Surprisingly enough, the way that you get better at this is by doing it over and over again and recognizing patterns in the way your games go. This is why I haven't talked about combo pieces at all in this video. If you see half of a combo on board, you already know it's a problem. I don't have to tell you that. The issue is being able to identify that it's a combo piece in the first place. There are so many potential ways to go infinite in this game that if I wanted to even list half of the ones players know about, I'd probably be here for another several hours. You aren't going to be able to memorize all of them, and your best bet is to memorize the ones that your pod plays, if any, and develop the game sense to identify cards that could have combo potential when you see them for the first time. Again, surprisingly enough, the only way you can get good at this is by playing a bunch of Commander. I wanted to give a bunch of clean and clear examples of threats and the times they show up, but I don't think that would have done anything useful for the average viewer, as the things I perceive as threats come from my own experience with the game, and the pods that I play in. The cards that I'm afraid of might be played fairly in your groups. The cards that I let go might be the ones that have beat your face down a dozen times. I think the only way to properly talk about this topic is by providing wide, general rules of thumb, and avoid hard, fast rules. Hopefully I've done a good job of giving you new ways to look at threats, who the problem is, who the problem could be, and where the problems could come from. This is also by no means the end of threat assessment and how to weave it into your gameplay. I intend to talk about this more in the future at a higher level, but as it stands, this video is already like 50% longer than I wanted it to be, so I'm leaving those points for later. If you got something out of this, or you want to support the channel, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, and if you want to ask me and a bunch of really smart people about deck building, or just shoot the breeze a little bit, feel free to join the Discord server. I kind of have a problem with group chats, so I'm incredibly active in there. Anyways, thanks for watching, and have a good one.